Hello there. Welcome to the Brains versus Stomachs Project research channel. You might have come here from the main channel, which is the BVS project, where we gear our content for a more casual audience. On this channel, however, we get into the details, and this is geared more towards the research, where we will go into the specifics of how we synthesize our arguments. This channel is geared for a more technical and scholastic audience. And in this video, I will be going through the details of what this channel is about, what our research thesis is about, what we're researching, and the required proficiencies and knowledge to engage with the work. Part 1, Thesis Statement, Demography Matters. So, our research statement is simple. Effectively, the demographic transition functions as an economic transition. That is, it has an identifiable and measurable expansionary effect on economic growth and productivity. Now, the problem we're trying to solve is fairly straightforward. All the evidence supports our statement. However, the contemporary theory, the dividend hypothesis, says otherwise. We are simply here to say that the evidence is correct and that the dividend hypothesis, brilliant as it is significantly flawed, and we're here to articulate that when you interpret the effect of demography on macroeconomic productivity through the neoclassical framework, when you interpret it correctly, indeed you do get a result that is similar to what the data tells us, that demography does indeed have a causal and expansionary effect on economic growth and productivity. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. Part 2, why? Why does demography matter? Well, the evidence speaks for itself. We've got our favorite chart here. On the x-axis is median age, estimate of a nation's population, age structure. On the y-axis is real GDP per capita adjusted for price levels. And this data is going back to 1950, 5-year intervals. Fairly straightforward. You can see that when nations are young, this quadrant here, you're talking median age 15 to 20, that's basically a stage 1, stage 2 population pyramid. Economic growth is low, nations don't really break out of economic poverty, and economic output is also low. But once a demographic transition kicks in, the economy expands, and once you get to the second quadrant here, which is broadly a stage 4, stage 5 population pyramid, right? That's a completed population demographic transition rather. You can see that economic output and prosperity, economic prosperity is pretty much guaranteed. You're looking at an average GDP per capita of approximately $30,000 and above. And so the evidence does suggest that the demographic transition does indeed have an expansionary effect on the economy. And we are simply here to say that, yes, this is a causal relationship. This is not spurious correlation. And that, like we said, demography matters. So why does demography matter? Well, let's start with the evidence. We've just showed you the evidence, right? You can't grow without a transition, and you can't fail to grow with a demographic transition. The mechanism, we won't get into it now, but it basically revolves around the concept of endogeneity. You see, the demographic transition is effectively endowing an economy with more labor hours per capita. And you need labor hours not only for output, but you also need labor hours for labor productivity, right? They all depend on adult labor. That's the core mechanism, and we're here to articulate how this works through the neoclassical framework. This is not a new idea. We get our inspiration from quite a few scholars. I think the main one is from unified growth theory. That is from doctors Oded Galor and David Weil. They got it right that the demographic transition does indeed function as a form, as an economic catalyst, if you will, and is necessary for growth and productivity. Another group of scholars we get inspiration from are the feminist economics. So, we're mainly looking at the work of Marilyn Waring, who arguably spawned the field, and Dr. Nancy Folbury, whose contribution on women's value in the economy is well, the leading expert in that field. And so we take great inspiration from their work, and we're here to basically articulate and amplify that argument that women's emancipation is indeed a core economic driver of economic growth and productivity. Part three, required knowledge, mostly economics and demography, but a good grounding in the adjacent fields of mathematics, statistics, gender studies, and health sciences is required. So, broadly speaking, in terms of required proficiencies, your power level, if you will, from an economics perspective, this is an economics project, so a very strong background in economics is required for your tertiary or extensive experience in a related field like quantitative finance or, fiscal policy or something. A good grounding in mathematics and statistics is also required, roughly 1 or 2 years tertiary, as well as strong, or very advanced proficiency in terms of secondary or high school. When it comes to demography, nothing too advanced required there. We'll build on it, but basically, if you have a sort of secondary or high school education in demography, you should be on the right path. In terms of gender studies, 2 years tertiary is required for that, and in terms of health sciences, 1 year tertiary. So broadly speaking, you're looking at, you will need at least a graduate level of understanding or, equivalent experience to engage with the work. Fairly advanced, but like we said, this is a formal research project and fairly good grounding in these fields is required. But let's now talk about the specific topics that will be required and that we will, our work will mostly revolve around. Starting with economics, you need to understand the basics. So you're talking equilibrium, aggregate demand, and supply markets and all that wonderful stuff, just the basics. In terms of macroeconomic modeling, that is key to our work. This is mostly macro, so a good grounding in endogenous models, your neoclassical models, your solo swans, and under other models in the neoclassical framework. You'll need to have a good grounding as well in models adjacent to the field of demography. So, overlapping generations model, and, we've talked about the dividend hypothesis and unified growth theory. In terms of development economics, a good grounding in institutions, agricultural and industrial economics is required, nothing too heavy. Later on in the project, we do quite a bit of heavy lifting in terms of, modeling. So a good grounding in econometrics is required. Dynamic systems, your time series, your DSGs. This is we are working with the neoclassical framework here, so that is important, as well as heterogeneous agents. We might delve into, well, we might pick from that modeling framework as well. In terms of math, starting with the basics, arithmetic, linear algebra, and calculus, that's mostly what we'll do. You don't need much outside that. You do need to have a good grounding in differential equations, however, that is necessary. Optimization is also key at its core. It's macroeconomics, so it's a constraint optimization problem at its core. So good grounding in your Lagrangians, your Hamiltonians, as well as some stochastic optimization will be required. Yes, we will touch very briefly on actuarial methods, nothing too heavy, fairly, just a few concepts here and there, mostly revolving around the hazard functions, as well as the Goldberg's-Makeham law. Statistics, the basics required, your analysis of variance, regression, statistical inference. A very good grounding in probability is required. We get into the distributions, confidence interval, and a little bit of Bayesian analysis as well. Stochastic processes is also required for this project. So, you need to know your Gaussians, your Markovs, branching, your stochastic differential equations. Again, yes, we will touch on some Ito calculus, so get ready for that. And broadly, that's the requirements from a more quantitative, field in terms of economics, math, and statistics. Now let's talk a little bit about the qualitative field. So starting with demography, the basics, mortality, fertility, migration, population distributions, those are required. And then a very good grounding in demographic transition theory is also required. You need to understand, fairly advanced concepts such as, momentum, stalls, as well as the second demographic transition. Now, we've got a niche field here, another niche field of intergenerationality. Yes, we will go into intergenerational transfers, issues to do with equity, aging. We do also draw on the work of Andrew Mason and Ronald Lee. It's the Lee-Mason framework, very important for our work, as you can probably pick up on our preprint, which I'll talk about later. So yeah, a fairly niche field. If you're not too familiar with that, don't worry too much. We will ease you into this topic. Now, next up is gender studies and sociology. We do go quite heavy into the issues of gender, so a good grounding in equality, women's emancipation, feminism, unpaid labor, intersectionality, very important. We will touch on some issues to do with inclusivity. Fertility is another important field. Effectively, we talk about fertility from a more mechanical perspective when we talk about demography and fertility. But fertility at its core is is a feminist topic. So we also look at fertility from a gender studies perspective. So that's important. Gender-based violence, gender roles, and a very big one here that is core to the work, and that is girls' education. Effectively, the argument we will be synthesizing and substantiating is how girls' education and women's emancipation more generally functions as a powerful economic catalyst. It really is, a key catalyst for economic expansion. So that's a core argument we're here to synthesize, and a good grounding in issues to do with gender studies, like we've mentioned here, is very important. We do also touch on inclusivity, and so issues to do with race and class and other forms of discrimination, stratification are important. We might touch on critical race theory and issues to do with inequality. From a political science perspective, political economy, geopolitics, and geoeconomics, nothing too heavy required there. Fairly niche. We won't go too heavy into issues to do with political science, but a cursory understanding of it might be useful. In terms of healthcare, very key component. We've talked about how women's emancipation functions as a key economic driver. So too does disease. And so the issue of epidemiology is very important. One will need to have a fairly decent understanding of issues to do with infectious and chronic diseases, tropical diseases, microbiology, immunology, and biostatistics, basic stuff, your Hales and other vitality statistics. So this is very important to the core argument that we're here to synthesize. That is the demographic transition, which is mostly a mortality and gender, transition, right? Mortality and fertility, if I can be more precise. And so issues to do with gender and health are very key. Finally, within the healthcare space, a good grounding in global health issues would also be important: access, equity, pandemics, and issues to do with climate and climate-related health. So that's the qualitative topics that we will cover and that you might need a good grounding in. Thank you for watching the episode. Thank you for your support. Please consider, like, share, and subscribe. Like I mentioned, this work is based on our preprint, so look out for that link in the video description below. And, you know, please support us on Patreon if this is something that adds value to your line of work or interest. Thank you and goodbye.